Hello, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, how are you? Can you hear me all right?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for taking this opportunity to just talk to me. I really
Sure.
appreciate you. It's
Absolutely.
I do want to say my name is Precious Regine. I am an aspiring cognitive neuroscientist currently in my master's of science program. I really do love your work. I actually took a look at some of your publications and I fell in love with your work by me reading your textbook that was required for one of my courses. And I was like, this textbook is so interesting and it's so easy to read. Because usually when I have to read textbooks, I have to like mentally prepare myself to read it and write it. But yours, I just find myself being drawn to it. And it's easier for me to retain the information because of the way you structured it with the common pitfalls and how to avoid them, the chapter reviews and the questions. So I do want to say I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. That is definitely my goal when I work on the textbooks. So I love hearing that from people who've used the textbooks. So
Yes, thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
sure. Let's see. I am in my 28th year, no, 27th year at Illinois State University. I did my undergrad at UCLA and my PhD in cognitive psychology at UC Irvine. Then I moved to the Midwest to take the job at Illinois State, and have been here ever since. My research area is human memory, so I'm a cognitive psychologist, as you know. And I teach courses primarily in cognitive areas, as well as research methods. But I have taught other things like intro psych, I've taught statistics, and I've taught those courses at both the undergrad and the grad levels.
Oh, wow, perfect. So, what would you say inspired your focus on human memory? Because I saw your work has procrastination, false
Mm-hmm.
memory, and things like that.
Yeah, so when I was an undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a school psychologist and I wanted to work with kids. But when I started working on the research with a faculty member there, I was doing things like coding videos, and I kind of found it very more subjective than I would have expected. It wasn't as objective in terms of objective science kinds of measures that I would have preferred. And so at the same time, I was taking a course on cognitive psychology that was being team taught by two memory researchers there. And I just loved it. I found that the content was fascinating. I found that the research was really interesting. So I signed up to work in the lab of one of those faculty members, and then decided that I wanted to shift my area to cognitive and specifically memory, and didn't look back. So,
Thank you. That is actually awesome. So, in one of my cognitive neuroscience classes, we learned about the age of cognitive decline around 60. And actually, ever since I learned, I'm always telling my parents about it. And my dad, he's 52, 50, in the 50s, and he's learning Spanish. And I'm like, that is so good for your
yeah,
cognitive health.
yeah.
So, I always
I
appreciate those sciences in that area, especially having parents that I want them to
mhm.
good cognitive.
Yep. I am also telling my parents, who are much older, the same things. And I did something similar to your dad, where I learned Japanese
Oh, wow.
in my 50s. So, and I started in my 40s. Now I'm in my 50s and approaching late 50s. And so I'm still trying to learn. I'm still working on it. So that's one of the things that I do in that sense to try to keep, I mean, other than my work, but keep my mind on things that are cognitively taxing. So,
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm actually just gonna go get ahead and get started on the questions I'm supposed to
okay,
ask so I can do my report on you.
sure.
The first question is, what are the most important environmental factors that impact the development of the individuals you provide services for in the field?
Okay, so As far as provide services for, that would probably be students I teach. And I would say that probably one of the most important environmental factors for them is finding an area where they can effectively study and work. One of the things about being a college student that's different from being a high school student is that a lot of what you do is self-initiated, self-motivated. I mean, yes, you are taking classes and they have a set time or place to do it, unless it's online, in which case then you're even more self-initiated and motivated. But just doing the work that is required outside of class requires some discipline. It requires someone to basically, put aside other things, distractions, and so forth, and set up an environment that I think can sort of help them really learn and develop in the skills and content that they are working on as college students. So I would say that that is probably one of the most important things. And nowadays, there's so many distractions. You have your phone anywhere near you. The research even shows that if your phone is upside down, if it's there and you can see it, it's distracting and it keeps you from focusing your attention. So I would say that that's probably the most important environmental kinds of things that impact the students I work with.
Perfect. Now, what would you say are the most important psychosocial factors?
Stress, definitely stress.
Mm.
Students are nowadays more stressed than they were when I started in terms of their reports of it. Studies have shown that, and I've seen that anecdotally with more students telling me that they're, overwhelmed and, they need a mental health day and, things like that. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest hindrances for people that are college students and, regardless of whether they are traditional college student age or whether they're non-traditional college student age, I'd say stress is sort of the biggest factor there.
I do want to say, hearing you say this is so fascinating because it's also reflected in your work. Like I said, with other textbooks that I have to read, it's just so emotionally, I have to convince myself to read them and try not to fall asleep. But every week when I have to read a few chapters from your book, I'm like, oh, this isn't so bad. Like there's not too much. It's concise and I can quiz myself, I can test myself at the end and it tells me the definitions of the word and I'm like, oh my goodness, I love this. I wish all textbooks were like this. I always find myself ahead of the chapters when I'm reading your book versus the other
Mhm.
classes. I'm like, okay, Precious, you have to do this now, now, now. So I do want to say that it is very reflective in your work, and
Yeah, good.
I can say that
I'm
this
gonna
is.
have to recruit you for promotional materials or something.
I am so down. So you talked about the environmental factors, the psychosocial factors. What would you say are some cultural factors?
Cultural factors, I would say, are things like whether the students are first generation college students, because they may not necessarily have been raised in an environment from their family that sort of encourages some of the um, self-discipline and importance of education and really engaging with the information and material that is being taught. That's probably one big factor in terms of culture, and that's not specific to a specific culture. It's just however the person was raised in that family may have an impact on the way that they approach college and the things they need to do.
Yeah, I will say I was actually born and raised in Nigeria, and I grew up in a very educationally like demanding family. And because I'm the first one in my family that lives in America that's been in school, when I was in high school, I didn't even realize that it was from high school. My work in high school determined what college I would
Mm.
go to until I was a junior in high school. And I was like, I just wish, of course, there was a lot of information out there that I could have seeked. I do take responsibility in that, but I didn't have that guidance
Yeah.
as much as I would have liked to, and I should have seeked
Hmm.
it, but
Yeah.
so
Yeah. But if you
like
sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and
yeah.
therefore it's difficult to know that you need to look for that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So.
Yes, that is true. And I'm glad that you spoke on it. So, in what ways has your understanding of lifespan development aided you in bridging cultural differences with the people you work with?
Well, one of the things that I have, I guess, developed in my teaching methods is to try to. So when I started off teaching, it was more about, treating everyone equally and making sure that the rules applied exactly the same way to every student. But as I kind of learned through teaching, students are coming from lots of different places. They have lots of different, stressors. They have lots of different backgrounds and so forth. And so trying to meet students where they are and trying to support them through whatever it is they've got going on is one of the ways that I try to deal with that, and have learned that that's better for students in terms of the way that I teach and the way I set up my courses. In fact, one of my decisions to start teaching courses online was came from that idea that not all students are, traditional live on campus, family funded students. They sometimes are living off campus. They sometimes have kids. They sometimes are supporting family members or caring for elderly family members, or having to hold down a lot of, full-time or even multiple part-time jobs in order to afford college. And so online asynchronous gives them the ability to kind of go at their own pace, figure out a schedule that works for them. They're not going to, if they can't make it to a class, they're not missing anything because it's all posted. They can go back and review it. They can go back and look at it when they have time. And sort of setting up courses to help support students who have some non-traditional needs like that.
Mm. Yeah, you actually touched a bit on the next question I was going to ask, which is how do you incorporate developmental theories and considerations into your work? And you did talk about individuals who are working to provide and just to afford colleges, having that online option is extremely helpful for them.
Yeah, that's one of the big ways I'd say that I have done that, or at least tried to do that in what I do as my work. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you incorporate cultural and contextual models and considerations into your work?
Um, well, given that I'm coming from sort of a cognitive perspective, this question is a little bit hard to answer because I don't tend to think about things in the sense of those kinds of models that are sort of taught and thought about as developmental in that sort of way. I can't say that there's any sort of formal model that I've really, worked through in kind of thinking about that, but just if you take, for example, my text writing, some of the things that I have in there are developmental concepts like scaffolding. So having students, and I do this in my classes too, having students do sort of small, stepwise kinds of build it bigger, start easy, start with basics, and then take those basics and move it higher and move it to a next level, and try to so scaffolding is one of those sort of developmental concepts. That's not really a formal model, although I guess if you go to like the Vygotsky stuff, scaffolding is a part of the Vygotsky the model of cognitive development. But that's just one thing that I can think of that would kind of fit that question. So.
Yeah, I do want to say this class that I'm doing the report for is for my lifespan development
Mhm.
class. So a lot of the questions are tailored
Yeah.
to that
Yeah,
specifically.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it sounds like, I mean, basically the wording of the questions is mostly it sounds like for people who kind of work with something in development. So like they have provide services or something that's more applied than the kind of thing I do. But there are ways to answer some of these questions that I think
Yeah,
fit what I do. So
yeah,
doing my
because I
best. So
you're doing an awesome job, and I really do appreciate it. It's just that a lot of my classmates, I would say they're more into like the IO psych, and I'm more into like cognition, science, like the neuroscientist aspect. So these questions are a bit challenging in the area I see myself in because you don't really think much about this when you're doing those kinds of work. But
yeah, yeah.
so I do want to say, please share an example of a case where developmental, cultural, and or contextual considerations were addressed in your work.
Um, it's hard to sort of think of a single example, but I can tell you generally about um, the development of students in our master's program. And this is probably true of almost all the students I've worked with in our master's program. So they come into our 2-year master's program with a very sort of undergraduate mentality of I go to class, I do the homework, I do what I'm told to do, and I get good grades if I do that well. But in grad school, there's a very different sort of setup. So there's a lot more to the program than just doing, taking their classes and getting grades in their classes. It's thinking about research and the field in a very different way. And so, students develop that sort of grad student mentality in very different ways, depending on their cultural background and sort of where they are developmentally as a student when they come in. But I try to work with each one of the students who work with me on that, and am amazed at seeing the development that happens in just a 2-year period from when they start, excuse me, with that sort of undergrad mentality to when they graduate and move on to either a job or a PhD program, and how differently they think about the research they're working on and the skills that they've developed in being able to conduct that research and report that research, present that research, and so forth to others.
Yeah, I do have a question about that. Do you think that motivation plays a role into like how soon they get into that grad school mindset? Like if they're like, "Oh, I'm really motivated to do this and contribute to the field of psychology," do you think they would be more willing to do what they need to do versus someone who's like, "Oh, I kind of want to do this. Let me just go as go with the flow."
Yes, yes, that definitely plays a factor, or is a factor in that development. So, one of the big differences in students is knowing what they want to do when they finish, and the students who know that are much more motivated to make that development and get to that place. I have worked with other students who are just sort of, I know that I'm interested in this. I don't know what I want to do with it, and they take longer to kind of move through the steps and sort of work their way through to that sort of end of development stage that we get them to in a master's program.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for
Mm-hmm.
clarifying that. I
Mm-hmm.
do want to ask, in what way has your developmental stage impacted your work as a professional in the field?
Well, when I look at that question, I think about what is a developmental stage for me. And developmental stage for me is that I'm sort of in the later part of my career. And that has sort of changed the kinds of things that I want to focus on. So, as an academic, we can choose each day kind of what to work on for the most part. There are deadlines and there are things that have to get done by a certain time, but there's nobody saying, hey, this is this report, I want you to do that today. There's nothing like that. And so what I have chosen to spend a lot of my time on are things that I think are one that I enjoy the most, and that is things like working one-on-one with students and that sort of thing. And things that are going to be lasting. So things like the textbooks that I work on, and that sort of thing. So that has changed a little bit. I mean, certainly over time. I mean, as an academic, you go through this development of stages through, you're an assistant professor when you're hired typically. And then you have to be productive enough in terms of research to get tenure and be promoted to associate professor. To be promoted from associate professor to full professor, you have to have a research body of work that is recognized by everyone as impactful on the field. And so once you've gotten to that point, then you sort of think, okay, so what's the rest of my career going to look like? And what am I going to do? And as I sort of am getting closer and closer to retirement, thinking about sort of what are the things that I want to accomplish before I'm done, and move on to something else for my life. So those are the things that I have thought about and started focusing my time and effort towards.
I love that. In what ways has your cultural influences impacted the work that you do as a professional?
Well, when I think about cultural influences, I think a little bit about my family and the way that I was raised, um, and not technically a first generation college student because my dad eventually did get a degree, but he didn't get it until, I was in high school, and he worked full time the whole time he was getting his degree. So he went to what used to be called night school, where, they would teach classes at night specifically for, because there was no online or anything then. And so he would take classes at night. And the sort of idea that I don't know, I guess what I do is still not necessarily always understood by my family. When summer hits, they always think, oh, well, now you're on vacation, right? It's like, well, no, I still have work I have to do over the summer, even though it's not technically teaching time or whatever. And so just sort of, I don't know, thinking about my job in a particular way, has been affected, I think, by the way that it's understood by my family. So,
That's a good point that I never even thought about thinking about like how would they perceive the work I'm doing, especially if I do plan on making this long term. So
mhm, mhm,
something to think about for sure. So,
mhm.
considering your work in psychology, what advice would you give to a new colleague in your specialization area?
Um, I think I would probably say something like, um, one, learn how to say no, because you get asked to do a lot, and you can't do everything, and you feel you don't want to get burnt out and you don't want to feel overwhelmed. But also, spend some time thinking about how you want to be a professional in this field, and decide what are some of the most important things. So there are lots of different types of academic jobs. There are some at like big time universities that are large, and they're considered what are called research one universities, where they tend to have lots of PhD programs. The faculty tend to not teach as much, but spend a lot more time on research and be required to bring in financial support for the research, so grants and things like that. And then they would be expected to publish at a rate higher than some of the others. There are schools that are sort of more in the mid-range. They're still large schools, but there are fewer PhD programs, and teaching is more balanced with research in terms of time and emphasis. And then I would say that there are smaller schools, some of which have a very large research component, but they're much smaller schools. They're considered liberal arts schools. They tend to be more focused on teaching and on individual students. And what you don't really experience in grad school, because most people get a PhD from an R1, a research one institution that's very large, and they're being advised by people who are in that kind of school or in that kind of environment. They're never really taught to sort of think about different ways to be in academia or different ways to be an academic. Like what are some of the things that are important to you? For me, teaching was just as important as research. And so I came to a place that had a good balance of that. I would be miserable being at a place where I had to compete with so many other people just to try to get financial support for research. And trying to feel like I was under so much pressure to, do those kinds of things. But I also, in some smaller liberal arts places, there's some good support for research in some places, but there are some small liberal arts places that have very limited resources for research. And they also to have fewer participants to participate in the research because they're smaller schools. So I decided this is the kind of place I wanted to be, despite the fact that, when I was in my PhD program, people would look down on the teaching and think that that wasn't as important a role in, their job and such. So, that's something that I think everyone should think about if they're going to go into academia, to sort of think about that sort of thing for themselves. I mean, if you are ambitious and you really want to make your name and mark and be well known in the field, then go do it. But just know what you're getting into and know what the pressures are going to be. So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I will say my passion for cognitive neuroscience actually sparked by taking a cognitive neuroscience class at UTD by a cognitive neuroscientist. So we do always appreciate the professors who are in that field as well and teaching us, because you're like, oh my goodness, this is very interesting. Maybe I want to be in this field. So it just gives some new insight. So I do appreciate
mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
So, one last question. How can
Okay.
someone like me who is passionate about the field of cognitive neuroscience and psychology best prepared to contribute meaningfully in this field?
Well, it depends on what you mean by contribute meaningfully, because there are lots of ways to do that. If you really want to do research, then going into academia is a way to contribute to that knowledge base. But if you say want to be some kind of practitioner doing cognitive assessments and things like that, that there's a whole different path for that. And so I think it really depends on kind of what your future career looks like for you. And I would give different advice depending on which path is more attractive to you.
Yeah, I will say I'm still figuring it out as I go. I know I love growth mindset and resilience, the cognitive aspect of it, because I went through
Mm-hmm.
a very traumatic time in my life. And I realized that the person who hurt me was hurt. So I had to break that cycle if I really wanted to move on. So I started attending a lot of seminars, reading a lot of books, a lot of nonfiction books, and that's what inspired me to be as resilient as I am today. So studying that and do even I never thought about the assessment part of it. Like that's just
Mm-hmm.
something new that sparked.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yep, and that's an important part of cognitive neuroscience is helping people be assessed for whether they do have any kind of cognitive difficulties, or are they on the path, say, to dementia or Alzheimer's and things like that. So that is definitely a career option, I think, if that's your interest. So
Yes. Thank you so much for taking your
sure,
time to do
of
this. I
course.
really appreciate you. It means a lot, and I'm honored and blessed to be here
Yeah.
doing this.
Thanks for all the wonderful things that you have said about my writing and my book.
I'm
And
saying the truth. It's
so good luck with your course and your
yeah.
assignment. And I hope all goes well for you and whatever you plan to do with your future.
Thank you so much. I will keep in touch with your publications because those are very interesting to look at.
Sounds good. If you ever have any questions, feel free to email me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day and stay warm. I know you're
Yeah.
in Illinois, so it's cold.
Yeah.
Even in Texas, we saw snow, and I was like, snow in
Yeah. Yeah.
Texas.
Yeah. No, it's currently snowing, so yes.
I will. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.